The Brutalist announced itself immediately as a big, important movie. It's 3 hours, 35 minutes long, inclusive of a built-in intermission. Fun fact, it's actually the 6th longest Best Picture nominee in history, behind Cleopatra, Gone with the Wind, Larry of Arabia, Ben-Hur, and the Ten Commandments. That runtime feels a bit like a statement, right? It announced itself as a big, important movie by taking up a lot of space, but in the service of a grand, epic story, visually, thematically, and at 215 minutes, temporally. And the built-in intermission both pads the runtime, but also makes the other 205 minutes feel more manageable. It's a clean division in the story and a welcome break from the pretty dense first half. But the intermission also seems like a pretty intentional throwback to the grand Hollywood epics of the 50s and 60s, when intermissions were more standard, much like the aforementioned Hollywood classics. To that point, The Brutalist is shot in VistaVision, the first feature film shot in that format since Marlon Brando made One-Eyed Jack 63 years ago. Director Brady Corbet says he chose this borderline dead technology because the movie takes place mostly in the 1950s, and he wanted a format invented in the 50s to give it that feel. So there's self-evident ambition here before we know a single thing about what the movie even is. The things around the movie indicate that this is an awfully big swing. And I'm starting here with all this context because that's how I experienced this movie. Even before it premiered at Venice in September, these were the things that had people talking. That it's an epic period drama that's the size and shape of the epic dramas from the period in question. And mouths began to water in film bros everywhere. Content-wise, it's just as ambitious as the context would suggest. The Brutalist sure seems to be aiming to be no less than like the great American novel in movie form, with grand statements about America and about assimilation and about artistry and about power and about labor and exploitation, all tied up in an immigrant story succinctly encapsulated by the wildly provocative image of the inverted Statue of Liberty. The immigrant in question is a Jewish-Hungarian architect named Laszlo Toth, played brilliantly by Adrien Brody in what's probably the performance of the year for me. The third shot of the movie is a long oneer that begins on Laszlo's back in the darkness. We follow him through the bowels of a ship. He opens the doors and the white light of America fills his eyes and the score really kicks in. And then it pans up to the already iconic Statue of Liberty shot. And it's just a pretty astounding opening to the movie. It's like a holy shit sequence. To paraphrase the producer of the 1997 Oscars telecast,
what a fucking opening!
Laszlo is a Holocaust survivor fleeing for his life, and his wife Erzsébet and their niece Sophia are still in Europe trying to survive long enough to follow Laszlo to America. So Laszlo is leaving home in order to find home, and this search for home, literally and metaphorically, is one of the main narrative thrusts of the movie. His first home in America is in the workshop of his cousin's furniture store in Philadelphia. His cousin's whole thing is that he's an assimilated immigrant. There might as well be a giant sign behind his head that says, "You gotta go along to get along." But Laszlo seems more resistant to the idea of needing to change fundamental things about himself in order to have a home here in America. The movie is not only interrogating what is home, whether it's a physical place to lay your head or a figurative place for safety and security with your family, it's also asking, what is the cost of home? How much compromising and suffering must one do to earn a place to call home? Who gets to decide whether or not you belong somewhere if you're allowed to call that place home? Laszlo and his cousin are hired by Joe Alwyn to redesign his filthy rich father's library in his mansion as a surprise. And they do a remarkable job. Laszlo is like a really, really good architect. The library they create is honestly breathtaking. But Joe Alwyn's father, Guy Pearce, doesn't like surprises and freaks out on Laszlo and refuses to pay. However, after Guy Pearce learns that Laszlo was a renowned architect in Europe and that his work was revered and had appeared in architectural periodicals, he seeks Laszlo out and pays him what he's owed. And then Guy Pearce conscripts Laszlo to design and build a large, ambitious, multifaceted, multi-use community center outside of Philadelphia, complete with a library, a gym, and a church. Basically saying, hey, Mr. Jewish immigrant, could you please build me an enormous testament to the different pillars of American life that I may or may not eventually let you in on? Thanks. It's at this point that I have to inform you that Guy Pearce's character is named Harrison Van Buren. On the Big Picture podcast, Adam Naiman quipped, "Why isn't his name POTUS Van Power Broker?" Put a pin in that for 1 second. Even more so than the concept of home, the most overt theme in the movie is the power struggle between artists who create and the money men who pay for it.
When dogs get sick, they often bite the hand of those who fed them.
In the second half of the movie, Van Buren and Laszlo go to the world-famous marble quarry in Carrara, Italy, to harvest marble to be used in the community center. I can't say much about the sequence because it contains arguably the most spoilable plot points, but I will say that it is initially an insanely beautiful, breathtaking sequence that becomes a more dark, insidious sequence where, to again quote Adam Naiman, the central metaphor becomes a meta-5. You'd be hard-pressed to find a better example of a movie literalizing its own central metaphor than the Carrera sequence in The Brutalist. The point here is that the movie can be extremely unsubtle in some ways, but more subtle in others. I'll use the character names as an example. Again, Guy Pearce, the man with the money, with the influence, with the power to make or break the people below him on the socioeconomic ladder, his name is just two US presidents smushed together. Sean Fennessy mused that Harrison Van Buren is a half step away from being named George Washington Trump. So, how did co-writers Brady Corbet and Mona Fastvold arrive at the name Laszlo Toth? Brief tangent. My wife and I visited Vatican City last fall and went to St. Peter's Basilica, and there we saw La Pietà. My first thought was, wait, is that the actual La Pietà, or just like a recreation of it? I was expecting it to be bigger, so I wasn't sure if it was like the real thing. So then I find myself walking around one of the most beautiful, most famous churches in the world on my phone, reading the Wikipedia page for La Pietà to find out where it is they keep that thing. And I confirmed, yes indeed, this was Michelangelo's actual La Pietà that I was looking at. But while on the Wikipedia page, I learned that in 1972, a deranged geologist took a hammer to the statue while shouting that he was Jesus Christ risen from the dead, and he took out Mary's arm and a part of her face before people subdued him. That deranged geologist was a Hungarian-born man named Laszlo Toth. Lest you think this is an enormous coincidence, Amy Nicholson's review of The Brutalist in the LA Times connects some dots here. Number one, she points out that La Pietà was sculpted by Michelangelo using marble harvested from Carrara, Italy, which, again, is the setting of maybe the most crucial scene in the second half of the movie. Number two, Michelangelo also used Carrara marble to sculpt the eventual papal tomb of Pope Julius II, but His Holiness refused to pay and stiffed Michelangelo. Despite being stiffed, Michelangelo later worked for Jules II again when he commissioned the Sistine Chapel. So, I can't say for sure what Brady Corbet and Mona Fastvold are going for here, naming their titular brutalist Laszlo Toth, but they are very clearly going for something. As Amy Nicholson points out, you can draw several parallels between our Laszlo and Michelangelo, from mining Carrara for marble to working on a magnum opus despite being previously denied payment for their art by their benefactor. Maybe Corbet and Fastvold just want to connect their main character to Michelangelo, and the quickest way to do that is to name him after the most famous Hungarian associated with Michelangelo, however obliquely. Or maybe they're trying to say that Laszlo Toth is both Michelangelo-like, but also self-destructive, given what their Laszlo does in the movie and what the real-life Laszlo Toth did to Michelangelo's work. Again, I don't really know, but it's intriguing and gives me stuff to think about. Maybe the most interesting and frustrating thing about the movie, at least for now, during the press tour and award circuit, is that it's kind of impossible to divorce the content of the movie from the context. I said earlier that the main theme of the movie is the power struggle between artists who create and the money men who pay for it. Brady Corbet is doing the interview circuit right now, and in most of his interviews, he talks about how hard it is to make the movie you want to make when you have to answer to producers and studio notes.
Final cut tie break goes to the director.
And that's what the movie's about. The context is the text. The Brutalist was slowly, independently financed over 7 years, including 3 years of delays to the start of production. The reported budget is only $10 million. For context, the Ten Commandments cost $13 million in 1956. The Brutalist is almost twice as long as Conclave, and it costs half as much. A movie this long that looks this good, I would expect it to be made for $80 million. That's a more sensible budget for a movie of this scale, but Brady Corbet didn't want to work with the bigger studios that could put up that kind of money after a reportedly unpleasant experience making his movie Vox Lux. So when we get scenes in The Brutalist where Laszlo berates his fellow architects for making changes to the building design that he didn't approve, that may be the director working through his feelings about not getting final cut on his last movie. There's a scene near the end of part 1 where Laszlo and Van Buren sit for a cocktail, and Laszlo says a line so important that they put it in the movie's soundtrack.
Is there a better description of a cube than that of its construction?
I take that to mean that the making of the thing is the thing. That's why the theme of the press tour has been the making of the movie. It's a movie about its own creation. And while I find that reasonably interesting, I guess I'm a little frustrated by how this has dominated the conversation around the movie. Like, it's cool that Corbet worked really hard to make a grand, ambitious testament to how hard it is to make a grand, ambitious work of art, but how's the movie? Is it worth the epic runtime? Does it stand up to the comparisons to the old Hollywood epics that it is so clearly inviting? Adam Naiman got into this a bit on The Big Picture, evoking the famous line in Family Guy where Peter critiques The Godfather.
It insists upon itself, Lois.
What?
It insists upon itself.
What does that even mean?
And kind of applies that to The Brutalist. Sometimes the insisting is annoying, or sometimes the insisting seems to be in compensation or in distinction to what's actually in it. So let's talk about what's actually in it. A pretty fucking remarkable movie, it turns out. I gotta start with the cinematography. I don't know if every movie shot in VistaVision looked this good, but damn, this looks good. The breathtaking vistas and the tight close-ups both feel epic. There are a lot of impressive wonders. Some of them are ostentatious and physical, and some of them are more subtle and maybe even easy to miss. The bombastic, brassy score really works for me.
Banana!
As did the gentler piano pieces riffing on the main theme. It's appropriately epic for the scale and ambition of the movie, but also modulates well to the quieter moments. It's currently the odds-on favorite to win the Oscar for score. Basically, everyone I've heard talk about The Brutalist has said that the first half is better than the second half, and that's because the first half is better than the second half. But I think the epilogue really ties it together. Maybe part of the reason I don't like the second half as much is because Laszlo is more barbed and uncompromising and gets maybe a little harder to root for, but then the epilogue kind of explains why in ways that I found interesting and satisfying. I've been thinking about that epilogue a lot since I saw it. I was pretty blown away by Adrien Brody's performance. I loved his physicality, particularly in how he carries himself and modulates that depending on who he's talking to. If I'm handing out Oscars, I'd probably give it to him, but an enormous tip of the cap to Chalamet's publicist. I am in absolute awe of his months-long Oscars campaign. Here's a question. Why didn't Guy Pearce have a bigger career after starring in two of the best movies of the late 90s and early 2000s? It's nice to be reminded about what a dynamite knockout actor this guy is. He's doing a lot here, voice, mannerisms, affectations, but I love it. He's nearly a cartoon character rich guy with how smarmy and pretentious he is, but I think it's a lot of fun. And as far as the ideas in the movie go, I think there's a decent amount to consider. I've already mentioned the themes that are most apparent to me, but I want to point out that Laszlo's struggle to find a home for himself and his family, and his complicated relationship with Van Buren and his pocketbook, are not at all separate ideas. It's all part of the same piece. The power dynamic between the two goes far beyond the fact that Van Buren employs Laszlo and funds his masterpiece. Van Buren also offers Laszlo limited access to a certain echelon of American wealth. People who wear tuxedos and sip brandy and have servants and brag about their philanthropies. When Van Buren finds Laszlo, he's working a back-breaking construction job. He's sleeping on a cot in a charity house, and he's addicted to heroin.
Tell me, why is an accomplished foreign architect shoveling coal here in Philadelphia?
I'm afraid it is not so simple.
Van Buren rescues him from all that and gives him back the life he left behind, that of a renowned, celebrated architect. So Van Buren is an essential player in Laszlo's struggle to find a home and to rebuild the life he was forced to flee from, but with many strings attached. Van Buren insists that Laszlo live at his mansion while he's building the community center, but in the guest house. Van Buren brings Laszlo to his fancy tuxedo and brandy parties, but only to parade him in front of his rich American friends as his interesting immigrant pet. Hand in hand with Laszlo's search for home is his search for belonging, and Van Buren is very much a gatekeeper to American life, both socioeconomically and nationalistically. Because Laszlo happens to be immensely talented and renowned in Europe, Van Buren deems Laszlo worthy of their American life. For now. But as Van Buren's son, Joe Alwyn, tells Laszlo, "We tolerate you."
They do not want us here.
Who do you mean?
The people here, they do not want us here.
I said at the top that The Brutalist announced itself immediately as a big, important movie. It does so with its scale, with its form, with its ambition, and with the director giving the "we lived this movie in order to make it" pitch in the interviews.
My film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. It's what it was really like.
So, is it a big, important movie? Yeah, I think so, for the most part. It's an enormous swing, and I think it mostly hits, but it's sometimes hard to talk about these things contemporaneously. That's why these are kind of fun to look back on years later and see my in-the-moment takes on stuff that may or may not stand the test of time. Some years we get Best Picture nominees that are just an obvious, indisputable masterpiece, instantly in the canon. We'll be watching this and talking about this for years. Some years we get nominees that feel in the moment like big significant work, but then you just don't ever once hear about it or think about it again after the Oscars. Some years we get a nominee where it's hard to tell, where maybe you're dazzled by the craft but not sure what to make of the movie in the moment. But then with the passage of time and repeat viewings, it clicks for you, and maybe that movie gets kind of reclaimed and slowly builds a consensus that this is one of the greats, and in hindsight, why didn't this win every Oscar? After 2 viewings, I'm not really sure where The Brutalist falls on that spectrum, but given how much more I got out of it on second viewing, maybe it's a phantom thread. On the Big Picture podcast, Sean Fennessy talked about how movies like this inspire what he calls canon guarding from some people. I think there's a little bit of concern when a movie like this comes along, where it's like, does it really stack up to The Godfather? And, well, is that the most important thing to say about the movie? And I think Adam Naiman hits the nail on the head when he counters that the canonization of The Godfather took time. It's not so much that people are trying to guard the canon, they're trying to guard the canon from people sneaking in the day their movie comes out. I mean, I think that's fair. I think The Brutalist is a pretty incredible movie, but is it an all-time great? Only time will tell. I'm not really going to concern myself with all that right now. Again, these are contemporaneous time capsules, so all I know right now is that The Brutalist is great, and I really admire what a big swing it is. Whether or not Brady Corbet and company succeeded in making an all-time great that will be watched and studied and talked about for years to come, it's pretty great that he tried.